Sivia, and thanks everyone for attending. Sivia, can you hear me okay? I just want to make
You
sure.
sound great, yes.
Okay, cool. We're going to do a few slides, and then we're going to quickly get into console and web browser for documentation, and maybe a code editor if the class wants to go that way, if the attendees want to go that way. We've been doing this cloud security masterclass on a number of topics. At this meetup, we thought it would be cool to share some on S3. So let's go ahead and jump in. And by the way, if you're not an expert on S3, that's fine. If you're not somebody who normally writes code, that's fine. We're going to explain concepts and we're going to make it relatable to everyone. And as Sivia said, you know, I've got my eye on the chat over there. Interrupt me whenever. Sivia will let me know if you've got a question or a comment, and I'm going to check too. So go ahead and make this as interactive as possible. That's how these things are, I think, best. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of why cloud security is different than non-cloud, pre-cloud security. And then we're going to spend a lot of time looking at S3 and how to build secure S3. There is no silver bullet. There are a number of concepts that we're going to try to communicate to you, and hopefully you can master with some guidance from us and get you pointed in the right direction. And then we'll have some Q&A. But again, ask questions anytime that you like. Okay. What we mean by a masterclass, when my co-founder came up with this idea, Josh, we should do a masterclass, I was a little uncomfortable. It's like, I don't know everything about S3. You know, what do we mean by this? So what we really mean, I mean, a little on my background before I get really rolling. I'm a co-founder of Fugue. Prior to that, I worked at AWS, where I was a principal solutions architect focused in national security and Department of Defense kinds of use cases. My career has been split between I'm in the DC area, split between national security kinds of stuff and you know, tech companies and startups. So what do we mean by this masterclass? We're gonna do a pretty deep dive, and you can guide me how deep you want to go. Okay, it's very much your time more than mine. So if you want me to drill in on something, ask a question. Sometimes we do interviews with folks. As Sivia said, the next one we're going to do, it's not at this meetup, but on our own kind of series, is an interview with a guy who's just a brilliant dude who knows how to take cloud infrastructure from uncompliant states to compliant states. And I'm just going to be the host in that one. Really, though, what we're trying to get to with this series is helping you, hopefully, to be able to reason about how to deal with cloud security. So this is not about giving you formulas. We'll talk some about use cases and specifics, but you can't master a topic by memorizing facts. You have to have your own ability to reason about it. The number of use cases possible are infinite. And so what I'm going to try to do is help you hopefully have a mental model and a way to think about these things, break down the problems into the big complexity of S3, which is vast, into simpler ways of thinking about it so you can understand the use case. And then finally, we're going to have some fun, and I'll describe that in a minute. Well, I think I'm just going to skip to what it is, and we'll talk about the fun. So one thing we like to do, we know that we and many of you like to go in the past to things like trade shows and get swag, and nobody's getting any swag. So we're going to give out swag over the course of this session this evening, and we're going to do it on this basis. I'm going to change my background to a Zoom background from kind of nerd culture, okay? And really what I mean is stuff that I like. So we're going to do video games, science fiction and anime, movies, and history of computing. Okay. And so when I change my background, I'm going to put one up in a second here. The first person who in the chat to everyone identifies what it is. So if I put up a picture of a computer, what computer is it? If I put up a screenshot from a video game or a movie, you know, what's the name of the movie? What's the name of the video game? The first person to name it in the chat publicly is going to get a cool t-shirt and some other stuff that we'll send out to you. So and we're going to do a bunch of these. So if you don't get the first one, don't feel bad. Now here's the rule though. If you win once during this session, you can't win twice. So stop guessing, even if you know, because that'll ruin it for everyone else. Okay. All right, let's start with, okay, we've already got a question. Hello from London, UK. How long do you think the session will go for? You know, an hour, roughly. Oftentimes people want to hang out longer, which is cool, but I'll try to wrap up and conclude a kind of a core information within an hour. So I'm going to start with, let's do, I think this might be kind of an easy one, but let's do a computer. All right, what is this computer behind me? And I think we blurred all the logos. I hope so. All right, so while we're waiting, Jonathan Cooper. No, we got a bunch of. Oh, right. Well, people are guessing. That's awesome. But the very first two, but Jonathan Cooper got it first. This is a Next Cube from the mid '80s, and an interesting fact about the Next Cube is that its operating system, which was BSD based and used Objective-C and used display PostScript, and these things might be starting to ring some bells, became macOS, which then became iOS, right, in a derivative form. So the Next almost died. The company almost went out of business, and then it became one of the most ubiquitous computing platforms in history. So that is all goodness. Also, the first computer I did object-oriented programming on, so I'm dating myself here. Okay, a little bit on the cloud misconfiguration, why it matters, and how it's different than traditional computing security. And all this is going to relate to S3. So every year we do a survey at Fugue of hundreds of companies that are and organizations that are operating at scale on the cloud. And we ask them a bunch of questions, not about Fugue, but about security on the cloud. And these were some answers we got this year, that 84% of our respondents were concerned that they had been hacked and did not know that. That made me happy. It should be 100, but 84 is pretty good. The reason I say that made me happy is not because I'm happy they are worried they've been hacked. I'm happy that they know they might not know. If you look at some of the major breaches, like for example, the Capital One breach, which was an S3 breach at the end, but was not purely an S3 breach, by the way. They only found out about this because the hacker bragged about it on social media. So how many of these breaches have occurred that are unknown to the people who have been breached? Probably, in my estimation, having focused purely on cloud security for almost a decade now, pretty much a decade, probably most breaches are unknown by the people who've been breached. All right, concerned they're vulnerable to a cloud breach, 92%. I'm even happier. This is a constantly evolving landscape, and the hackers are extremely sophisticated, and the attack surfaces are, even though cloud's been around for a little while, people are still thinking in the wrong terms. They're thinking about network perimeters. And those matter, but far less than they used to. So most folks out there are aware that they are probably vulnerable, and they're right. They probably are. And then will misconfiguration risk stay the same or increase over the year. 76% said increase. Yes, that is objectively correct, because new cloud services come out, which increase attack surface and potential for misconfiguration. And in addition to that, your cloud footprint is probably growing, which means there are more resources that could be attacked. And that means risk is going up, and it's going to continue to go up. So Dave Linthicum made this comment that he's seeing a lot of cloud configuration errors in the real world, and it's scaring the hell out of him. Yes, cloud misconfiguration is almost an endemic problem, and it should be worrying to you. A little bit on hacker strategy. I see we've got a question from Yefim. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I will get to that in one sec. I'm going to describe this slide and then I'll answer your question. A little bit about hacker strategy and how that has evolved. So in the kind of the old days, the primary way that hackers would go after organizations is by first targeting the organization. Now, this does still happen, but it is not the primary mechanism. So in the old days, and in some cases now, folks will be like, well, I want to hack Twitter's, control backplane, which happened not that long ago. So they target Twitter, and then they search for vulnerabilities, or they use, social engineering or other techniques to go after that organization. North Korea did this to Sony. Those who will not be named did it to the Iranian nuclear program, right? It does happen. It can happen to you. But the normal way now is that the hackers are constantly running automation against any internet-facing endpoints looking for vulnerabilities. They're not doing this manually. They have, bot networks. They have automation out there that are examining anything that goes public, identifying vulnerabilities, and then they have a shopping list they can choose from. And this is actually how Paige, the woman who hacked into Capital One, she woke up one morning and saw, or afternoon or whatever, and saw, oh, Capital One's on the list, and I know what vulnerability they have, so I'll go after that. So why does this matter? There are a number of reasons. The first is you lose anonymity immediately. There is no security through obscurity. If you have a public-facing endpoint, and in this, we're going to talk primarily, exclusively about S3, but if you have anything on the internet, bad guys are finding it. The second thing that you really need to consider about this is how quickly they're finding it, because this is automated. So an acquaintance of mine and the person I trust most on this topic told me, Josh, on an average, it's probably 7 minutes or less between a new DNS record appearing and going live, or IP endpoint going live on the internet, and it being scanned by at least one bad actor for vulnerabilities. So you do not have time to have things be wrong, and you do not have obscurity or anonymity. So you can read the, discover and skilled or well-funded hacker groups are employing automation to discover and exploit misconfigured cloud assets within hours of their deployment. That is a rose-colored glasses assessment. It's minutes. Okay, to the question here from Yefim. So the question is, does this mean Amazon does not help customers by running security health checks to ensure low-hanging fruit security problems get identified right away? Amazon does a lot to try to help you do that. And this gets to one of the fundamental problems and difficulties in S3 security. I want to keep track of time here. We're 19 minutes in, so I got to keep moving. But they do a lot to try to help you. Here's the issue. S3 is a tremendously powerful service. You can do, it probably serves north of 25% of the internet. So when you think about that, and it probably serves a whole lot more data in private applications, right, behind the public-facing stuff. So it is extraordinarily powerful, very configurable, and there is no silver bullet. So you have to actually understand it. And no script or program, I mean, Fugue will really help you understand where you have exposure, much more than Amazon will, but they try to. But the reason we're doing this session is for you to understand really how to own S3, to design your S3 implementation the right way. And you can't expect a tool to completely do that for you. So Amazon has some good stuff there. We have much deeper stuff there, but you still have to understand it. Okay. All right. Now we're just going to jump in. That was my slides. We're going to jump into doing some talking and demonstrating. All right. Let's go over here. If you could show me your hand in Zoom here, if you consider yourself to be pretty advanced on S3. I just want to get a read on where I should target the level of complexity. So there's a raise hand button. All right, we're getting a few. If you're confident on S3, okay. All right, so what I'm going to do, it's a mix. So what I'm going to do, and for those of you who are more experienced, bear with me, because I am going to be talking about some pretty deep topics. And the way I'm going to do it is by introducing to you all the choices you can make in configuring an S3 bucket as we go through. I'm going to do this in the console, right? So you can see it graphically. All this can be done via CLI and API. But as we go through this, I'm going to be describing them and all the choices and what the implications are. And then if we have time, we can drill into deeper use cases. All right, so don't consider this to be a kind of remedial. We're using create bucket here so that we can walk through all your choices and we can discuss what they mean, because a lot of times people gloss over this and that's how they get in trouble. All right, let's just call this, so I don't know, Sam, you don't need to see my contacts there. Sam Bridges, Sam Porter Bridges. All right, so we're going to create a bucket. You give it a bucket name. Must not contain, oh, right, I got to just start it with a lowercase. I'm off to a good start. All right, so Sam Porter Bridges. I'm not going to copy, I'm just going to put it in a region. You can choose what region you want. If you have data sovereignty concerns, this relates to your security and compliance. So if you're in EU and you're worried about GDPR, you probably don't want your bucket in the United States, right? I'm going to leave it in the US because not much latency for me, and I want to make sure we move along here. All right, so let's go next. I'm not going to copy from an existing bucket. I want to grind through in painful detail everything about this bucket configuration. And by the way, when we get to the bottom of the hour in a few minutes, I'm going to put up another background and you'll get another chance to win some swag. Okay, let's walk through these things. Versioning. So versioning, if your data, now I'm going to remind you here, one of the critical aspects of security is not losing data, right? If you think about things like ransomware, they're about taking your data from you and selling it back to you. Versioning helps you here. If you have versioning turned on, even if a bad actor, if a hacker manages to corrupt or encrypt or anything else your latest version, if you turn this on, you'll just be able to roll it back and tell them to pound sand. Now you're going to pay for additional data in S3, which is honestly not that expensive unless you're operating at really substantial scales, in which case there are strategies you can use to include versioning and also do things like move things off to Glacier or other techniques over time. I would argue that unless you're doing ephemeral data that can be easily recreated from another source outside of S3, you want to turn this on. Just pretty much all the time. All right, server access logging. This one gets a little confusing because you've got server access logging here, and then down here you have object level logging, which is sending events to CloudTrail. So what is server access logging? Server access logging is essentially, so S3 is essentially a giant distributed web server. So server access logging is your way of getting web logs from S3. It takes time. It takes variable amounts of time. It can take hours. But I generally turn this on, and I'm going to jump ahead. You're going to target an S3 bucket. You're going to target another S3 bucket to dump those web logs into, okay? Let's just send it there. And I'm going to give it a prefix so that the logs that land there from this S3 bucket have a file name prefix. Now I'm going to get, I think on average, I think it's 4 hours actually. So it might be an hour, I'd have to look. You're going to get web logs that you can import and analyze. You might think, well, I'm going to do CloudTrail. Why would I do this? That's valid. That's valid. However, I like redundancy. I come from a national security background. I come from a very security-focused background. And so single points of failure, especially on information that I might need to use to investigate an incident or to understand what happened in the case of a security incident, I want more, not less, okay? So I'm gonna turn that on. You can tag a bucket. You're usually gonna do that. It's not that security related, to be honest. But if you're not familiar with tags, it's just a way to keep track of stuff in AWS. A lot of people tag on like the team or the application, etc. All right, keeping going.
Josh, I just wanted to, Guled had a question for you. Wouldn't it be better to put those logs in another lockdown AWS account for audits?
It sure would. That's what we do. Yes. That is a better idea. However, the way to do that one, I mean, I think you can do it under server logs. I've never tried it there. But this object level logging, where you're sending those events to a CloudTrail, that CloudTrail you can target across accounts. So in Fugue's case, our production accounts, we have a completely private account where all of our log data goes via CloudTrail. So yes, that is a good practice. And the reason it's a good practice, now keep in mind that if the bucket you are sending the server logs to has versioning turned on, right? We're starting to go down the rabbit hole here. So on this bucket, we've turned on versioning. But if on this bucket, we've got versioning too, then you have the history. Like if somebody gets in and corrupts that data, you have the history. So, so yes, generally speaking, I would argue that your kind of security and control plane stuff should not be in your production AWS account. It should be external. I believe you can point server access logging to an external bucket, but I've never done it, so I'm not sure. I know you can do that with object level logging. I would turn both on. These are maybe apparently redundant, but you know, sometimes things fail. Also, CloudTrail can get super asynchronous. Usually CloudTrail responds very quickly within a second or 10. They don't make any promises. They say to expect 15 minutes, but I've seen CloudTrail take the better part of a day to record an event, and they're not necessarily in order. In fact, they're often not in order. So, so I would do both. They're cheap, and you're really going to be glad you did if you have an event. Okay. So I'm going to do both read events and write events. So anytime somebody gets something out of that bucket, anytime somebody puts something in that bucket, I want that in that CloudTrail. All
So
right.
Josh, there is one other question. I'm sorry.
No.
It's David asked, do you have to have the bucket for logging created already, or will AWS create it on the fly?
No, I think you have to make it. I think you have to make it. I've not tried getting them to create one on the fly, but I believe you have to make it. Yeah, pretty sure about that. Because what you're doing here is an API call to configure this AWS service. And so you have to have a value to pass into that, right? You have to be able to tell it when you make that API call to do the log requests for server access logging, where to put them. Okay, I'm gonna change my background to give folks another chance. I'm gonna stop my share, and I'm actually gonna stop my video for a second so I can pick out a cool background. Hold on, well, let's go. We did something from the history of computing. Let's do something different. Oh, come on, you. There we go. So I've got a new background up. We don't get a, oh, Antonio got it right out of the gate. It is the video game Death Stranding. So Kojima's latest, and I would argue an absolute masterpiece of video games. Congratulations to Antonio. You didn't need to put a question mark on that, man. You knew it. All right, let's go back, and we will do. I think we got time for at least 2 more. So okay, so let's talk about encryption. Right, we made it down to here. I've pretty much told you use everything so far. Let's talk about encryption. You've got some choices in encryption, and not everyone understands what they mean. So I want to really drill in on this because this is important. Okay, so if I uncheck this, my data will be plain text in S3. If I select this first option, just AES 256, use server-side encryption with AWS S3 managed keys, what does that mean? Here's what it means. Your data at rest is encrypted, but if anyone has access to that S3 bucket through its bucket policies, its ACLs, its IAM roles, etc., that data gets converted to plain text and transmitted over the wire in plain text with no other controls on it. So I have had people ask me, why does that exist? What is the point of having an encryption option that if a hacker gets access to an S3 bucket, all the data is exposed to them in plain text? That's what that means. The answer, I believe, and I'm not speaking for Amazon here, this is just my theory, is that there are compliance standards. Feud, by the way, we do cloud security and compliance all day long. We're constantly dealing with this. And you'll often have like, is all your data at rest encrypted? And you say, yes, it is, right? Because you're required to encrypt it at rest, even though it's going to get transmitted over the wire in plain text with no additional permissions. So the only other thing I can speculate as to why this setting is useful is because if you're worried about Amazon themselves being able to read your data, right? Now, it's an Amazon managed key, so that doesn't really make sense, but some people think that. So I would argue that if you have an S3 bucket that is designed to be facing the public internet with no access controls, don't use any encryption at all. It doesn't matter. You're putting public data out. You already don't care. If you have data that you want to restrict access to, I don't think this setting really gives you much, if anything. This one does. This is completely different. So This setting is AWS KMS, the key management service. Use server-side encryption with AWS KMS managed keys. Okay, now this is where you're going to be able to encrypt data in a way that a person who just has access to S3 will only get encrypted data out. They also need access to the KMS keys. And if you're a hacker, getting access to 2 service endpoints like that with enough credentials to use them is probably an order of magnitude harder than getting access to just one. So my own personal opinion is public data, encrypted or not, it's up to you. If you're living in a compliance standard that says all, or whether it's your company policy or a compliance standard that says all encrypted shall be, all data shall be encrypted at rest, rather, then you can turn this thing on and you get that and you meet the letter of the law. But from a practical perspective, I don't see it as that big a deal. This is how you actually secure data in S3 to keep it from getting stolen by hackers or bad actors. So there you would select a key. I don't have one configured in this region, so I can't turn that on honestly today. So I'm just going to leave it on AES 256. I apologize for that. I thought I had a key set up. You would just select a KMS key that you had provided. I could back out and go to another region. I think I'm in, yeah. So moving on, advanced settings, object lock. This is cool. If you have a use case where you have a legal or logical requirement that an object be retained exactly as it is for a period of time, and this is common in things like medical records. In the old days, we had technologies called WORM, write once, read many. Often it was optical drives and big robots and cabinets. This is WORM on S3, okay? You have to have versioning turned on for this to work. This has to be turned on to use this. But if you have a use case where you're dealing with legal records of any sort, you're gonna want that. And you're able to set the amount of time. I'm not going to drill too far into that because that's a fairly specific and narrow use case. CloudWatch request metrics say monitor requests in your bucket for an additional cost. How is that different than CloudTrail? You might be asking. They're pretty similar. Here's the difference. CloudWatch costs a lot more, but it's fast and it guarantees that it's fast. So if you really want to be monitoring this stuff in near real time, CloudTrail might help you, and sometimes it will let you down. But CloudWatch will help you. So I would view these as alternatives. If you're gonna do CloudTrail because you don't need like near real-time monitoring, that's cool. Then don't turn this on. If you do need near real-time monitoring, turn this on, and you can put things like alerts on what's happening in CloudWatch. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next. All right, this is one of the most misunderstood features of S3. Block public access. Excuse me for a sec, I'm getting a little bit of a dry mouth. I'm going to take a sip of my beverage.
While you're doing that, is it okay if I put up a poll?
Oh yeah, please do.
I just,
Actually, while we're doing all that, I'm going to put up another background. People are guessing these real fast.
I know, we've got a smart audience.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
All right, this one might be a little tougher. Kind of going back in the day here. This is a movie. A very, very famous kind of seminal science fiction movie. Oh, we've got some Q&As going here. It's not 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's not Star Trek. It's further off the beaten trail. It's not Alien. It was not American. Not American. All right, so we got a question in Q&A. What happens when you copy your SSE KMS encrypted S3 bucket to another region? Will you have to decrypt it first and then re-encrypt it in the other region? I believe what you would need to do is from the endpoint where you are performing that copy, you would need access to the KMS service with access to the keys. Because what AWS will do, if you try to retrieve an object from S3 and you have access to the KMS keys from the endpoint you're retrieving it, it will decrypt it for you. So if you were to do like an S3 sync or something like that across, and you were to do that from an endpoint that had, oh, Ayush got it. I'm going to come back to this. There's a lot going on here. So let me finish the answer and then I'll come back. But we have a correct background there. I believe the way that would work, and again, this is something I would have to do myself to fully validate. So I try to caveat anything that I haven't actually done with that, but I'm fairly confident that your endpoint that you're doing the S3 read commands from, if it had access to the KMS keys via the API, and it doesn't matter what region it's in to answer the other question, you just need to be able to call that that API on KMS and have access to those keys, that essentially then you're getting the plain text. And if you were to move it into another bucket in another location using different keys to encrypt it, it would go from the one encryption with the one set of keys to plain text back to a new set of encryption with a new set of keys, okay? The correct answer to the background is Solaris, which is a 1972, a 1972 film out of the Soviet Union, and it was remade maybe like 10 years ago or something with George Clooney in it. But I highly recommend both versions. The original is amazing. It's kind of an art film as much as a sci-fi film. And I was just asked by Alfonso if I still use Solaris. And all right, man, I get it. I'm old. Actually, my first Sun operating system was SunOS, which preceded Solaris. So it's a fair question, and I love it.
Boy, and Antonio's beating you up, huh?
Yeah, well, you know, I deserve it. Okay, so let's talk about block public access. I want to respect time. We're at 5:43. Okay, 5:43 Eastern. So block public access really is telling you what it's doing. Don't pay attention to the name. Pay attention to the specifics of what it's saying. And in fact, I want to pull up the docs for this, because even this display kind of gives you a false sense of security, okay? I can just probably Google that. I'm well familiar with this doc. I just don't have it pulled up. All right, I think this is the one I want. Yes, okay. So back to the actual S3 management console. So public access is granted to buckets and objects through access control list, bucket policies, access point policies, or all. Okay, they're starting to tell you that there are actually 5 different layers of policy control on S3. Depending on how you count, there might be more. Okay, so you have to be acutely aware of this. And in part 2 of this series, and we have it recorded, I go really deep into the layers of security in S3. 5 of them: ACLs, bucket policies, IAM roles, block public access, and access points. Here, they're saying that public access can be granted through ACLs, bucket policies, access points, or all. All right. So what does that mean? It means that on any given S3 bucket or object, actually, it's not a perfect mapping, but the Venn diagram is pretty strong. Something might be granting public or near public access through any of those mechanisms. And that starts to give you a clue why we as a company exist, to help you understand where your exposures are, right? Because you might be looking at what's called a bucket policy and think, I'm good, but an ACL or an access point configuration have actually exposed you in some way, okay? So the interaction of those policy layers is really important to understand. We won't have time today to really drill deep into that, but again, the recording is out there and I'm happy to come back if there's interest. So what block public access is going to do, it is going to examine all of those, all three of those. As it says here, these settings apply only to this bucket and its access points. You can actually turn this on account-wide if you need to. AWS recommends that you turn it on, but before applying these settings, ensure your applications will work correctly without public access. So in other words, you might have stuff out there, if you start to impose this block public access, that breaks because something in your infrastructure is using public access. So let's talk through these 4 settings, and then I'll show you what they really mean, because this is the hand-holdy version, and it's not fully accurate. It's not wrong, but it's not completely correct either. Okay, so block public access to buckets and objects granted through new ACLs. So what this setting is going to do is it's only going to be concerned with ACLs, access control lists, which, by the way, Amazon tells you you should not ever use. It's a legacy feature. S3's been around for more than a decade, I think 14 years. ACLs were the original way to control S3 access, but they tell you themselves, you probably shouldn't use it anymore, okay? So this first setting will only block new public ACLs, leaving all your historic public ACLs open, okay? I would turn that on. For one reason, you shouldn't be using ACLs anyway. 2, block public access to buckets and objects granted through any ACL. So this is retrospective. This is saying go back in time and anything with an ACL on it that's public within the scope of my applying this service, this feature, will be blocked. Okay, I'll turn that on. Block public access to buckets and objects granted through new public bucket or access point policies. We've changed the kinds of policies we are talking about. Everything in AWS is granted access via one form of policy or another, because the default policy of AWS is to deny all requests. You have to open up somehow. We can do some Q&As here. You have to open up somehow access. So what this is saying is these 2 were about ACLs, and these 2 are about bucket policies, which is how you should do this, not ACLs. In real life, use bucket policies. And access points. And access points are kind of for a very specific use case. I'll briefly describe them in a minute, but I don't want you to get distracted right now. So those are like the English high-level kind of fuzzy descriptions. But let's see what it's really doing. Okay, so we're going to go here. So the actual settings are block public Acls. Setting this option, ACL, ACL, they're synonymous. Setting this option to true causes the following behavior. Put bucket Acl and put object Acl. Calls fail if the specified access control list is public. Okay, what do we mean by public? Right, that's kind of highly relevant. So the meaning of public, Amazon recognizes that's highly relevant. Okay, S3 considers a bucket or object Acl public if it grants any permissions to members of the predefined all users or authenticated users groups. Okay, that's at the Acl level. But at the policy level, when evaluating a bucket policy, S3 begins by assuming the policy is public, right? Hence deny. It then evaluates the policy to determine whether it qualifies as non-public. To be considered non-public, a bucket policy must grant access only to fixed values, values that don't contain a wildcard, of one or more of the following. What's the very first one? A set of classless interdomain routings or CIDRs. Are folks here familiar with what CIDR blocks are? Because immediately you should know, if you're familiar with CIDR blocks, they are descriptions of blocks of IP addresses, that the Amazon definition of non-public could be most of the internet, right? You could have a set without wildcards of CIDR blocks that represents millions and millions and millions of IP addresses, and block public access would tell you nothing and do nothing about that whatsoever, because it's not just star. Okay? You can have, if an AWS principal, a source ARN, a source VPC, how many things can be in a VPC? A whole lot of things can be in a VPC. A VPC endpoint, right? Here, I'll just show you one real quick. So you've got in Amazon, this is the Fugue interface, by the way. We do all this visualization and analysis for you. But here I'm showing you a VPC network, and it has an endpoint that is connecting over to S3. So you could grant this whole VPC or a set of VPCs or a set of endpoints of VPCs access, and it would not be considered public. Well, what if one of those VPCs is something that contains stuff that's public? So I hope you see where I'm going with this. That block public access is a helpful and good feature, but it is no silver bullet. And by turning it on, you are not necessarily protecting yourself from hackers. A lot of the breaches of S3 happen through a combination of layers of attack against things like the vulnerabilities in IAM that grant principal permission to S3 buckets that block public access won't find anything to do with at all. All right, I'm going to say next here. This is just a review, and I'm just going to create that bucket. So I just created a fairly secure bucket. I said fairly secure because there's a whole lot more that personally I would do to this in order to truly secure this. Also, what I just created doesn't have any access. Remember, the default is deny, and I didn't grant anything. So I didn't make this public. I didn't use an ACL. So I have to have some way to grant access. And this is kind of a lead up to the next session if we want, if folks want it, or you can watch a recording of IAM policies and bucket policies are how you do that. Looks like we've got a question. Since we're coming up toward the top of the hour, I'm gonna stop my share, I'm gonna stop my video, and I'm gonna do another background here. I don't know, you guys tell me in the chat, do you want history of computing or video games? All right, history of computing. Oh man, that's okay. That's all right. Let's try this one. This is going way back in the day.
You asked for it, you got it, guys.
Yeah, man, that was overwhelming. Apple I, Commodore, mini computer, IBM. Nope.
So Josh,
question.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you if I don't know if you saw the questions in the Q&A about KMS.
Yeah, I spoke to those.
Okay, cool.
Already.
Okay.
All right, so here's the question that I saw go by. What must we do if we want to deploy a static website on S3 and we cannot block public access entirely? That's a very good use of S3. We do it. Create a bucket policy. Create a bucket policy that grants public access to it. So a lot of people will say, well, Amazon has this setting they go through, right? In the docs, Amazon tells you not to use ACLs. But then they give you this option to create we got a winner. Let me make sure I got the first one. Yes, Peter Steffen. This is, oh, no, you had the wrong version. You were close, but the correct version came from George Johnson. This is the Xerox Alto, the computer that inspired the Macintosh, the first mouse-driven computer. You programmed it using Smalltalk, which was an elegant weapon from a more civilized age. It was a thing of great beauty. So that was the alto, and we've got a winner. Awesome. I love who come to these classes. You know all the cool stuff, at least the stuff I think is cool. But back to S3 and public access, do it in a bucket policy. Why not do ACLs? AWS almost leads you down the path to doing, here I'll show you, almost leads you down the path to doing ACLs and then tells you in the docs not to. So let's just do like, I don't know, where was it? Sam Porter Bridges. So let's pull this open and we'll do, I think it's under permissions. Yeah, let's look at access control list. So I could have like public access everyone, list and write objects, and read bucket permissions and write bucket permissions. This is going to fail because I turned on block public access. Well, why do they put this in the UI under ACLs, right? That's an ACL. And in the docs, they tell you not to do that. This is the easy way, right? Here's the problem. Each bucket can have, I would argue, should have a bucket policy. Bucket policy is far more powerful than Acl, okay? Now, why not just use Acls for things that can be totally public and bucket policies for other things? What happens when you have 20,000 S3 buckets and you're trying to figure out whether you're vulnerable and where do you look for that, okay? I would completely not use Acls and only use bucket policies. You can create a bucket policy easily. I think I've got one sitting in my code editor somewhere. Let's go here. I think this guy. Yeah, here's the public read bucket policy. Here we go. So this is a bucket policy. I'll just show this to you quickly because we're running low on time. Here what we're saying, and this is AWS policy language. Well, AWS policy JSON format. Language is maybe too generous. So here we're just saying the version of the API, and we're calling it public read. We're saying the effect is allow. The principle is anybody, right? And the action is get object on the name of that bucket. This is how I believe the best way, the best practice for how to do public access for static websites. It's a great use case for S3. I would do it in the bucket policy, not in the Acl. Okay, another question. Would you still use bucket policy to grant public access to a handful of specific files in a private bucket? Isn't there a size limit to bucket policy? Yes, there is. So let's break that down. Now, Paul here is pointing out something kind of interesting. Most people think about these security controls as being at the bucket level only, but actually you can do stuff against the objects in buckets too. So let's go find one here with some data in it. Oh, I secured this bucket. I secured this bucket so much that the console can't read it. I'll show you how to do that next time. Because actually that's a good thing to do for reasons that may be inobvious without my going into depth. All right, now I've gone in here. Let me walk through what I just did. I opened up this all your base bucket, and I've got some objects in here. So if I open this ping file, this is going to tell me some things about it. This is just a purely public image. Oh, no, it's not. I actually secured that. This is a bucket with objects in it that I actually did some clamp down on.
See how good you are?
Yeah, man. I need to pick the right bucket. All right, but here you can see that the object itself also has things like access and permissions. So here you see there is no bucket policy on the object, right? Because it's a bucket policy. You can set Acls on the object. You may need to do that, but I would try hard to avoid it. In fact, but the broad point is you can drill down beneath the bucket layer and have object level Acls. I would never use that if I could possibly avoid it. Imagine trying to understand what's going on. over time. Buckets are free. All they are strings at the front of URLs. That's it. They're free. I would make different buckets for different use cases, for different audiences, generally speaking. Now, there is a mechanism called access points where you can apply different bucket policies to the same S3 bucket with different endpoints. So a use case I like to think about here is, you're doing medical data, on COVID, and you want everyone to be able to read it, but you only want a select number of researchers to be able to write to it. You might create 2 access points and put different bucket policies on them. I believe it's a 20K limit on bucket policies. And, when you think about, let's look again at what policy, quote unquote, language looks like. Let's look at something a little fancier. If you imagine 20K of that, it gets ugly. This is JSON. It's not even real code. So what this one is doing is really clamping down a bucket hard to a VPC endpoint. So yes, there is a limit on the size of the bucket policy. Do you want to ever hit it? You're probably doing something wrong if you're hitting it. You should probably be looking more at things like IAM and baking in the ability to grant access via IAM rather than restrict on bucket policy. But there's lots of ways to think about it. So we're up at the top of the hour. As I mentioned in part two, normally in part 2 of this, the next hour is when I really drill into like designing based on use case and how to leverage IAM and bucket policies, etc. So I don't really have, even if we run long, I don't have time to do all that. But if there's interest, I'll do it again. All right.
There's also, for those of you who are interested, we do have a masterclass that we have gone to part 2, and we also have gone to the IAM building, making it highly secure for your IAM. And that's also, if you go to our YouTube page, you'll find those videos there as well. So
okay, before I turn my screen back on, I'm going to do one more background. You guys really wanted history of computing. So this is another obscure one.
And the other thing that I wanted to let you all know is that I have put in chat the links for the masterclass on Thursday. And we are doing a demo of Fugue on Wednesday. So you have those there in the chat.
All right, so far we've heard Compaq and ThinkPad. No, this is a company that no longer exists. It was based in Britain.
Oldsmore. Love that.
No, this might be too obscure.
Yeah. We've got one hand raised. I'm not sure where that.
Not an Acorn, although those were cool. Not a Sinclair. No, this was high-end military stuff, mil-spec stuff in the 80s.
And by the way, Antonio, if you're still on the call, we, in order to send you the swag, you'll need to privately send me to to panelists your email so I can send you information to get your address.
Neil got it.
Neil.
It's a grid. These were super cool. They were electromagnetically shielded. So when the Soviets would set up electromagnetic readers for like keyboard, signals coming off outside of or inside of the U.S. Embassy in the Soviet Union, actually, you couldn't read what somebody was typing. They were super cool, and you could drop them off a building. My mom actually had one at that time when she was doing programming for the DoD. So grid computer. All right. Well, hey, we got some interest in follow-up. I love doing these things. We love talking to all of you and talking about, this is a topic, we're really passionate about. So thank you very much for spending your time with us this afternoon. We'll see how we follow up. I know Sylvia is going to send out a recording, and we'll send you links to other YouTube content we've done on these topics. But
And
awesome.
also, one last thing, we are in the works with Dan Mullaney about putting together some meetups around cloud security in financial services as well as healthcare. So if any of you are in that field, stay tuned for your Meetup website, and we'll be announcing that. All right, everybody. Thank you so much.
Have a good one.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.